Chapter IV. Hiram's Bedesmen. The parties most interested in the movement which is about to set Barchester by the ears were not the foremost to discuss the merit of the question, as is often the case; but when the bishop, the archdeacon, the warden, the steward, and Messrs Cox and Cummins were all busy with the matter, each in his own way, it is not to be supposed that Hiram's bedesmen themselves were altogether passive spectators. Finney, the attorney, had been among them, asking sly questions and raising immoderate hopes, creating a party hostile to the warden, and establishing a corps in the enemy's camp, as he figuratively calls it to himself. Poor old men! Whoever may be righted or wronged by this inquiry, they, at any rate, will assuredly be only injured. To them it can only be an unmixed evil. How can their lot be improved? All their wants are supplied, every comfort is administered, they have warm houses, good clothes, plentiful diet, and rest after a life of labour. And above all, that treasure so inestimable in declining years, a true and kind friend to listen to their sorrows, watch over their sickness, and administer comfort as regards this world and the world to come. John Bold sometimes thinks of this when he is talking loudly of the rights of the bedesmen whom he has taken under his protection, but he quiets the suggestion within his breast with the high-sounding name of justice, fiat justitia ruat coelum. These old men should by rights have £100 a year instead of 1 shilling and 6d. a day, and the warden should have £200 or £300 instead of £800. What is unjust must be wrong. What is wrong should be righted, and if he declined the task, who else would do it?
Each one of you is clearly entitled to £100 a year by common law.
Such had been the important whisper made by Finney into the ears of Abel Handy, and by him retailed to his 11 brethren. Too much must not be expected from the flesh and blood even of John Hiram's bedesmen, and the positive promise of 100 a year to each of the 12 old men had its way with most of them. The great Bunce was not to be wiled away, and was upheld in his orthodoxy by 2 adherents. Abel Handy, who was the leader of the aspirants after wealth, had, alas, a stronger following. No less than 5 of the 12 soon believed that his views were just, making with their leader a moiety of the hospital. The other 3, volatile, unstable minds, vacillated between the 2 chieftains, now led away by the hope of gold, now anxious to propitiate the powers that still existed. It had been proposed to address a petition to the bishop as visitor, praying his lordship to see justice done to the legal recipients of John Hiram's charity, and to send copies of this petition, and of the reply it would elicit, to all the leading London papers, and thereby to obtain notoriety for the subject. This, it was thought, would pave the way for ulterior legal proceedings. It would have been a great thing to have had the signatures and marks of all the 12 injured legatees, but this was impossible. Bunce would have cut his hand off sooner than have signed it. It was then suggested by Finney that if even 11 could be induced to sanction the document, the one obstinate recusant might have been represented as unfit to judge on such a question, in fact as being non compos mentis, and the petition would have been taken as representing the feeling of the men. But this could not be done. Bunce's friends were as firm as himself, and as yet only 6 crosses adorned the document. It was the more provoking as Bunce himself could write his name legibly, and one of those 3 doubting souls had for years boasted of like power, and possessed indeed a Bible in which he was proud to show his name written by himself some 30 years ago, Job Sculpit. But it was thought that Job Sculpit, having forgotten his scholarship, on that account recoiled from the petition, and that the other doubters would follow as he led them. A petition signed by half the hospital would have but a poor effect. It was in Sculpit's room that the petition was now lying, waiting for such additional signatures as Abel Handy by his eloquence could obtain for it. The 6 marks it bore were duly attested thus: his, Abel X Handy, Greg E. X Moody, Matthew X Spriggs, Mark, etc., and places were duly designated in pencil for those brethren who were now expected to join. For Sculpit alone was left a spot on which his genuine signature might be written in fair clerk-like style. Handy had brought in the document and spread it out on the small deal table, and was now standing by it, persuasive and eager. Moody had followed with an inkhorn, carefully left behind by Finney, and Spriggs bore aloft, as though it were a sword, a well-worn ink-black pen, which from time to time he endeavoured to thrust into Sculpit's unwilling hand. With the learned man were his 2 abettors in indecision, William Gazey and Jonathan Crumple. If ever the petition were to be forwarded, now was the time. So said Mr. Finney, and great was the anxiety on the part of those whose £100 a year, as they believed, mainly depended on the document in question.
To be kept out of all that money,
as the avaricious Moody had muttered to his friend Handy,
by an old fool saying that he can write his own name like his betters.
"Well, Job," said Handy, trying to impart to his own sour, ill-omened visage a smile of approbation, in which he greatly failed. "So you're ready now, Mr. Finney says. Here's the place, d'ye see," and he put his huge brown finger down on the dirty paper. "Name or mark, it's all one. Come along, old boy. If so be we're to have the spending of this money, why, the sooner the better. That's my maxim."
"To be sure,"
said Moody,
"we aren't none of us so young. We can't stay waiting for old Catgut no longer."
It was thus these miscreants named our excellent friend. The nickname he could easily have forgiven, but the allusion to the divine source of all his melodious joy would have irritated even him. Let us hope he never knew the insult. "Only think, old Billy Gazey," said Spriggs, who rejoiced in greater youth than his brethren, but having fallen into a fire when drunk, had had one eye burnt out, one cheek burnt through, and one arm nearly burnt off, and who therefore, in regard to personal appearance, was not the most prepossessing of men. "100 a year, and all to spend. Only think, old Billy Gazey," and he gave a hideous grin that showed off his misfortunes to their full extent. Old Billy Gazey was not alive to much enthusiasm. Even these golden prospects did not arouse him to do more than rub his poor old bleared eyes with the cuff of his beadsman's gown, and gently mutter, "He didn't know, not he. He didn't know." "But you'd know, Jonathan," continued Spriggs, turning to the other friend of Skulpit's, who was sitting on a stool by the table, gazing vacantly at the petition. Jonathan Crumple was a meek, mild man, who had known better days. His means had been wasted by bad children, who had made his life wretched, till he had been received into the hospital of which he had not long been a member. Since that day he had known neither sorrow nor trouble, and this attempt to fill him with new hopes was indeed a cruelty. 100 a year's a nice thing for sartin, neighbour Spriggs, said he. I once had nigh to that myself, but it didn't do me no good. And he gave a low sigh as he thought of the children of his own loins who had robbed him. "And shall have again, Joe," said Handy, "and we'll have someone to keep it right and tight for you this time." Crumple sighed again. He had learnt the impotency of worldly wealth, and would have been satisfied, if left untempted, to have remained happy with 1 6d. a day. "Come, Skulpit," repeated Handy, getting impatient, "you're not going to go along with old Bunce in helping that parson to rob us all. Take the pen, man, and write yourself. Well," he added, seeing that Skulpit still doubted, "to see a man as is afraid to stand by hisself is, to my thinking, the meanest thing as is." "Sink them all for parsons, says I," growled Moody. "Hungry beggars, as never thinks their bellies full till they have robbed all and everything." "Who's to harm you, man?" argued Spriggs. "Let them look never so black at you, they can't get you put out when you're once in. No, not old Catgut, with calves to help him." I am sorry to say the archdeacon himself was designated by this scurrilous allusion to his nether person. 100 a year to win, and nothing to lose," continued Handy. "My eyes! Well, how a man's to doubt about such a bit of cheese as that passes me. But some men is timorous. Some men is born with no pluck in them. Some men is cowed at the very sight of a gentleman's coat and waistcoat." Oh, Mr Harding, if you had but taken the archdeacon's advice in that disputed case, when Joe Mutters was this ungrateful demagogue's rival candidate.
"Afraid of a parson!"
growled Moody with a look of ineffable scorn.
"I tell ye what I'd be afraid of. I'd be afraid of not getting nothing from 'em but just what I could take by might and right. That's the most I'd be afraid on of any parson of 'em all."
"But," said Skulpit apologetically, "Mr Harding's not so bad. He did give us 2d. a day, didn't he now?"
"2d. a day!"
exclaimed Spriggs with scorn, opening awfully the red cavern of his lost eye.
"2d. a day!"
muttered Moody with a curse.
"Sink his 2d."
"2d. a day!" exclaimed Handy, "and I'm to go hat and hand and thank a chap for 2d. a day when he owes me £100 a year! No, thank ye. That may do for you, but it won't for me. Come, I say, Skulpit, are you a going to put your mark to this here paper, or are you not?" Skulpit looked round in wretched indecision to his two friends. "What d'ye think, Bill Gazy?" said he. But Bill Gazy couldn't think. He made a noise like the bleating of an old sheep, which was intended to express the agony of his doubt, and again muttered that He didn't know.
Take hold, you old cripple,
said Handy, thrusting the pen into poor Billy's hand.
there, so. Ugh, you old fool, you've been and smeared it all. There, that'll do for you. That's as good as the best name as ever was written.
And a big blotch of ink was presumed to represent Billy Gaze's acquiescence.
Now, Jonathan,
said Handy, turning to Crumple. 100 a year's a nice thing for sartin, again argued Crumple. Well, neighbour Skulpit, how's it to be? Oh, please yourself, said Skulpit. Please yourself, and you'll please me. The pen was thrust into Crumple's hand, and a faint, wandering, meaningless sign was made, betokening such sanction and authority as Jonathan Crumple was able to convey. Come, Job, said Handy, softened by success, don't let 'em have to say that old Bunce has a man like you under his thumb, a man that always holds his head in the hospital as high as Bunce himself, though you never ax to drink wine, and sneak, and tell lies about your betters, as he does. Skulpit held the pen and made little flourishes with it in the air, but still hesitated. And if you'll be said by me, continued Handy, you'll not write your name to it at all, but just put your mark like the others. The cloud began to clear from Skulpit's brow. We all know you can do it if you like, but maybe you wouldn't like to seem uppish, you know. Well, the mark would be best, said Skulpit. One name and the rest marks wouldn't look well, would it? The worst in the world, said Handy. There, there. And stooping over the petition, the learned clerk made a huge cross on the place left for his signature. That's the game, said Handy, triumphantly pocketing the petition. We're all in a boat now, that is, the 9 of us. And as for old Bunce and his cronies, they may... But as he was hobbling off to the door with a crutch on one side and a stick on the other, he was met by Bunce himself. Well, Handy, and what may old Bunce do? Said the grey-haired, upright senior. Handy muttered something and was departing, but he was stopped in the doorway by the huge frame of the newcomer. You've been doing no good here, Abel Handy, said he. 'Tis plain to see that, and 'tisn't much good, I'm thinking, you ever do. I mind my own business, Master Bunce, muttered the other, and do you do the same. It ain't nothing to you what I does, and your spying and poking here won't do no good, nor yet no harm. I suppose then, Job, continued Bunce, not noticing his opponent, if the truth must out, you've stuck your name to that petition of theirs at last. Skulpit looked as though he were about to sink into the ground with shame. What is it to you what he signs? Said Handy. I suppose if we all wants to ax for our own, we needn't ax leave of you first, Mr. Bunce, beggar man as you are. And as to your sneaking in here, into Job's room, when he's busy and where you're not wanted, I've knowed Job Skulpit, man and boy, 60 years, said Bunce, looking at the man of whom he spoke, and that's ever since the day he was born. I knowed the mother that bore him, when she and I were little wee things picking daisies together in the close yonder, and I've lived under the same roof with him more nor 10 years, and after that I may come into his room without axing leave,
and yet no sneaking neither."
"So you can, Mr Bunce," said Skulpit; "so you can, any hour, day or night."
"And I'm free also to tell him my mind," continued Bunce, looking at the one man and addressing the other; "and I tell him now that he's done a foolish and a wrong thing. He's turned his back upon one who is his best friend, and is playing the game of others who care nothing for him, whether he be poor or rich, well or ill, alive or dead. 100 a year! Are the lot of you soft enough to think that if 100 a year be to be given, it's the likes of you that will get it?"
And he pointed to Billy Gazy, Spriggs, and Crumple.
"Did any of us ever do anything worth half the money? Was it to make gentlemen of us we were brought in here, when all the world turned against us, and we couldn't longer earn our daily bread? Aren't you all as rich in your ways as he in his?"
And the auditor pointed to the side on which the warden lived.
"Aren't you getting all you hoped for? Aye, and more than you hoped for? Wouldn't each of you have given the dearest limb of his body to secure that which now makes you so unthankful?"
"We wants what John Hiram left us," said Handy. "We wants what's ourn by law. It don't matter what we expected. What's ourn by law should be ourn, and by goals we'll have it."
"Law!"
said Bunce, with all the scorn he knew how to command.
"Law! Did ye ever know a poor man yet was the better for law, or for a lawyer? Will Mr. Finney ever be as good to you, Job, as that man has been? Will he see to you when you're sick, and comfort you when you're wretched? Will he—"
"No, nor give you port wine, old boy, on cold winter nights. He won't do that, will he?"
asked Handy; and, laughing at the severity of his own wit, he and his colleagues retired, carrying with them, however, the now powerful petition. There is no help for spilt milk, and Mr. Bunce could only retire to his own room, disgusted at the frailty of human nature. Job Skulpit scratched his head. Jonathan Crumple again remarked that,
"For sartain, sure 100 a year was very nice."
and Billy Gazy again rubbed his eyes, and lowly muttered that
he didn't know.
Chapter 5. Dr Grantly visits the hospital. Though doubt and hesitation disturbed the rest of our poor warden, no such weakness perplexed the nobler breast of his son-in-law. As the indomitable cock, preparing for the combat, sharpens his spurs, shakes his feathers, and erects his comb, so did the archdeacon arrange his weapons for the coming war, without misgiving and without fear. That he was fully confident of the justice of his cause, let no one doubt. Many a man can fight his battle with good courage, but with a doubting conscience. Such was not the case with Dr Grantly. He did not believe in the gospel with more assurance than he did in the sacred justice of all ecclesiastical revenues. When he put his shoulder to the wheel to defend the income of the present and future precentors of Barchester, he was animated by as strong a sense of a holy cause as that which gives courage to a missionary in Africa, or enables a sister of mercy to give up the pleasures of the world for the wards of a hospital. He was about to defend the Holy of Holies from the touch of the profane, to guard the citadel of his church from the most rampant of its enemies. to put on his good armour in the best of fights, and secure, if possible, the comforts of his creed for coming generations of ecclesiastical dignitaries. Such a work required no ordinary vigour, and the archdeacon was therefore extraordinarily vigorous. It demanded a buoyant courage and a heart happy in its toil, and the archdeacon's heart was happy, and his courage was buoyant. He knew that he would not be able to animate his father-in-law with feelings like his own, but this did not much disturb him. He preferred to bear the brunt of the battle alone, and did not doubt that the warden would resign himself into his hands with passive submission. "Well, Mr. Chadwick," he said, walking into the steward's office a day or two after the signing of the petition, as commemorated in the last chapter, "anything from Cox and Cummins this morning?" Mr. Chadwick handed him a letter, which he read, stroking the tight-gaitered calf of his right leg as he did so. Messrs. Cox and Cummins merely said that they had as yet received no notice from their adversaries, that they could recommend no preliminary steps, but that should any proceeding really be taken by the bedesmen, it would be expedient to consult that very eminent Queen's counsel, Sir Abraham Haphazard. "I quite agree with them," said Dr Grantly, refolding the letter. "I perfectly agree with them. Haphazard is no doubt the best man, a thorough churchman, a sound conservative, and in every respect the best man we could get. He is in the House too, which is a great thing." Mr. Chadwick quite agreed. "You remember how completely he put down that scoundrel Horseman about the Bishop of Beverley's income, how completely he set them all adrift in the earl's case." Since the question of St. Cross had been mooted by the public, one noble lord had become the earl par excellence in the doctor's estimation. How he silenced that fellow at Rochester! Of course we must have Haphazard, and I'll tell you what, Mr. Chadwick, we must take care to be in time, or the other party will forestall us." With all his admiration for Sir Abraham, the doctor seemed to think it not impossible that that great man might be induced to lend his gigantic powers to the side of the church's enemies. Having settled this point to his satisfaction, the doctor stepped down to the hospital to learn how matters were going on there, and as he walked across the hallowed close and looked up at the ravens, who cawed with a peculiar reverence as he wended his way, he thought with increased acerbity of those whose impiety would venture to disturb the goodly grace of cathedral institutions. And who has not felt the same? We believe that Mr. Horseman himself would relent, and the spirit of Sir Benjamin Hall give way, were those great reformers to allow themselves to stroll by moonlight round the towers of some of our ancient churches. Who would not feel charity for a prebendary when walking the quiet length of that long aisle at Winchester, looking at those decent houses, that trim grass plat, and feeling, as one must, the solemn orderly comfort of the spot? Who could be hard upon a dean while wandering round the sweet close of Hereford, and owning that in that precinct tone and colour, design and form, solemn tower and storied window, are all in unison, and all perfect? Who could lie basking in the cloisters of Salisbury, and gaze on Jewel's library and that unequalled spire, without feeling that bishops should sometimes be rich? The tone of our archdeacon's mind must not astonish us. It has been the growth of centuries of church ascendancy, and though some fungi now disfigure the tree, though there be much dead wood, for how much good fruit have not we to be thankful? Who, without remorse, can batter down the dead branches of an old oak, now useless, but still so beautiful, or drag out the fragments of the ancient forest, without feeling that they sheltered the younger plants, to which they are now summoned to give way in a tone so peremptory and so harsh? The archdeacon, with all his virtues, was not a man of delicate feeling, and after having made his morning salutations in the warden's drawing room, he did not scruple to commence an attack on pestilent John Bold in the presence of Miss Harding, though he rightly guessed that that lady was not indifferent to the name of his enemy. "Nelly, my dear, fetch me my spectacles from the back room," said her father, anxious to save both her blushes and her feelings. Eleanor brought the spectacles, while her father was trying, in ambiguous phrases, to explain to her too practical brother-in-law that it might be as well not to say anything about Bold before her, and then retreated. Nothing had been explained to her about Bold and the hospital, but with a woman's instinct she knew that things were going wrong. "We must soon be doing something," commenced the archdeacon, wiping his brows with a large bright coloured handkerchief, for he had felt busy and had walked quick, and it was a broiling summer's day. "Of course you have heard of the petition?" Mr Harding owned, somewhat unwillingly, that he had heard of it. "Well," the archdeacon looked for some expressions of opinion, but none coming, he continued, "We must be doing something, you know. We mustn't allow these people to cut the ground from under us while we sit looking on." The archdeacon, who was a practical man, allowed himself the use of everyday expressive modes of speech when among his closest intimates, though no one could soar into a more intricate labyrinth of refined phraseology when the church was the subject and his lower brethren were his auditors. The warden still looked mutely in his face, making the slightest possible passes with an imaginary fiddle bow, and stopping as he did so sundry imaginary strings with the fingers of his other hand. 'Twas his constant consolation in conversational troubles. While these vexed him sorely, the passes would be short and slow, and the upper hand would not be seen to work. Nay, the strings on which it operated would sometimes lie concealed in the musician's pocket, and the instrument on which he played would be beneath his chair. But as his spirit warmed to the subject, as his trusting heart, looking to the bottom of that which vexed him, would see its clear way out, he would rise to a higher melody, sweep the unseen strings with a bolder hand, and swiftly fingering the chords from his neck down along his waistcoat and up again to his very ear, create an ecstatic strain of perfect music, audible to himself and to St Cecilia, and not without effect. "I quite agree with Cox and Cummins," continued the archdeacon. "They say we must secure Sir Abraham Haphazard. I shall not have the slightest fear in leaving the case in Sir Abraham's hands." The warden played the slowest and saddest of tunes. It was but a dirge on one string. "I think Sir Abraham will not be long in letting Master Bold know what he's about. I fancy I hear Sir Abraham cross-questioning him at the Common Pleas." The warden thought of his income being thus discussed, his modest life, his daily habits, and his easy work, and nothing issued from that single chord but a low wail of sorrow. "I suppose they've sent this petition up to my father?" The warden didn't know. He imagined they would do so this very day. "What I can't understand is how you let them do it, with such a command as you have in the place, or should have, with such a man as Bunce. I cannot understand why you let them do it." "Do what?" asked the warden. "Why, listen to this fellow Bold, and that other low pettifogger Finney, and get up this petition too. Why didn't you tell Bunce to destroy the petition?" "That would have been hardly wise," said the warden. "Wise! Yes, it would have been very wise if they'd done it among themselves. I must go up to the palace and answer it now, I suppose. It's a very short answer they'll get, I can tell you." "But why shouldn't they petition, doctor?" "Why shouldn't they?" responded the archdeacon in a loud brazen voice, as though all the men in the hospital were expected to hear him through the walls. "Why shouldn't they? I'll let them know why they shouldn't. By the by, warden, I'd like to say a few words to them all together." The warden's mind misgave him, and even for a moment he forgot to play. He by no means wished to delegate to his son-in-law his place and authority of warden. He had expressly determined not to interfere in any step which the men might wish to take in the matter under dispute. He was most anxious neither to accuse them nor to defend himself. All these things he was aware the archdeacon would do in his behalf, and that not in the mildest manner, and yet he knew not how to refuse the permission requested. "I'd so much sooner remain quiet in the matter," said he in an apologetic voice. "Quiet!" said the archdeacon, still speaking with his brazen trumpet. "Do you wish to be ruined in quiet?" "Why, if I am to be ruined, certainly." "Nonsense, warden! I tell you something must be done. We must act. Just let me ring the bell and send the men word that I'll speak to them in the quad." Mr Harding knew not how to resist, and the disagreeable order was given. The quad, as it was familiarly called, was a small quadrangle, open on one side to the river, and surrounded on the others by the high wall of Mr Harding's garden, by one gable end of Mr Harding's house, and by the end of the row of buildings which formed the residences of the bedesmen. It was flagged all round, and the centre was stoned. Small stone gutters ran from the four corners of the square to a grating in the centre, and attached to the end of Mr Harding's house was a conduit with 4 cocks covered over from the weather, at which the old men got their water, and very generally performed their morning toilet. It was a quiet, sombre place, shaded over by the trees of the warden's garden. On the side towards the river there stood a row of stone seats, on which the old men would sit and gaze at the little fish as they flitted by in the running stream. On the other side of the river was a rich green meadow, running up to and joining the deanery, and as little open to the public as the garden of the dean itself. Nothing, therefore, could be more private than the quad of the hospital, and it was there that the archdeacon determined to convey to them his sense of their refractory proceedings. The servant soon brought in word that the men were assembled in the quad. The archdeacon, big with his purpose, rose to address them. "Well, warden, of course you're coming," said he, seeing that Mr Harding did not prepare to follow him. "I wish you'd excuse me," said Mr Harding. "For heaven's sake, don't let us have division in the camp," replied the archdeacon. "Let us have a long pull and a strong pull, but above all a pull all together. Come, warden, come. Don't be afraid of your duty." Mr Harding was afraid. He was afraid that he was being led to do that which was not his duty. He was not, however, strong enough to resist, so he got up and followed his son-in-law. The old men were assembled in groups in the quadrangle, 11 of them at least, for poor old Johnny Bell was bedridden and couldn't come. He had, however, put his mark to the petition as one of Handy's earliest followers. 'Tis true he could not move from the bed where he lay. 'Tis true he had no friend on earth but those whom the hospital contained, and of those the warden and his daughter were the most constant and most appreciated. 'Tis true that everything was administered to him which his failing body could require, or which his faint appetite could enjoy; but still his dull eye had glistened for a moment at the idea of possessing £100 a year
to his own cheek,
as Abel Handy had eloquently expressed it, and poor old Johnny Bell had greedily put his mark to the petition. When the 2 clergymen appeared, they all uncovered their heads. Handy was slow to do it, and hesitated, but the black coat and waistcoat of which he had spoken so irreverently in Sculpit's room had its effect even on him, and he too doffed his hat. Bunce, advancing before the others, bowed lowly to the archdeacon, and with affectionate reverence expressed his wish that the warden and Miss Eleanor were quite well, and the doctor's lady, he added, turning to the archdeacon, and the children at Plumstead, and my lord. And having made his speech, he also retired among the others, and took his place with the rest upon the stone benches. As the archdeacon stood up to make his speech, erect in the middle of that little square, he looked like an ecclesiastical statue placed there, as a fitting impersonation of the church militant here on earth. His shovel hat, large, new, and well pronounced, a churchman's hat in every inch, declared the profession as plainly as does the Quaker's broad brim. His heavy eyebrows, large open eyes, and full mouth and chin expressed the solidity of his order. The broad chest, amply covered with fine cloth, told how well-to-do was its estate. One hand, ensconced within his pocket, evinced the practical hold which our mother church keeps on her temporal possessions, and the other, loose for action, was ready to fight, if need be, in her defence. And below these the decorous breeches and neat black gaiters, showing so admirably that well-turned leg, betokened the decency, the outward beauty and grace of our church establishment. "Now, my men," he began, when he had settled himself well in his position, "I want to say a few words to you. Your good friend the warden here, and myself, and my lord the bishop, on whose behalf I wish to speak to you, would all be very sorry indeed, that you should have any just ground of complaint. Any just ground of complaint on your part would be removed at once by the warden, or by his lordship, or by me on his behalf, without the necessity of any petition on your part." Here the orator stopped for a moment, expecting that some little murmurs of applause would show that the weakest of the men were beginning to give way. But no such murmurs came. Bunce himself even sat with closed lips, mute and unsatisfactory. "Without the necessity of any petition at all," he repeated. "I'm told you have addressed a petition to my lord." He paused for a reply from the men, and after a while Handy plucked up courage and said,
"Yes, we has."
"You have addressed a petition to my lord, in which, as I am informed, you express an opinion that you do not receive from Hiram's estate all that is your due." Here most of the men expressed their assent. "Now, what is it you ask for? What is it you want that you haven't got here? What is it?"
100 a year,
muttered old Moody, with a voice as if it came out of the ground.
100 a year!
ejaculated the archdeacon militant, defying the impudence of these claimants, with one hand stretched out and closed, while with the other he tightly grasped and secured within his breeches pocket that symbol of the church's wealth which his own loose half-crowns not unaptly represented.
100 a year! Why, my men, you must be mad! And you talk about John Hiram's will! When John Hiram built a hospital for worn out old men, worn out old labouring men, infirm old men past their work, cripples, blind, bedridden, and such like, do you think he meant to make gentlemen of them? Do you think John Hiram intended to give 100 a year to old single men who earned perhaps 2 shillings or half a crown a day for themselves and families in the best of their time? No, my men, I'll tell you what John Hiram meant. He meant that 12 poor old worn-out labourers, men who could no longer support themselves, who had no friends to support them, who must starve and perish miserably if not protected by the hand of charity, he meant that 12 such men as these should come in here in their poverty and wretchedness, and find within these walls shelter and food before their death, and a little leisure to make their peace with God. That was what John Hiram meant. You have not read John Hiram's will, and I doubt whether those wicked men who are advising you have done so. I have. I know what his will was, and I tell you that that was his will, and that that was his intention. Not a sound came from the 11 bedesmen as they sat listening to what, according to the archdeacon, was their intended estate. They grimly stared upon his burly figure, but did not then express by word or sign the anger and disgust to which such language was sure to give rise. "Now let me ask you," he continued, "do you think you are worse off than John Hiram intended to make you? Have you not shelter and food and leisure? Have you not much more? Have you not every indulgence which you are capable of enjoying? Have you not twice better food, twice a better bed, 10 times more money in your pocket than you were ever able to earn for yourselves before you were lucky enough to get into this place? And now you send a petition to the bishop, asking for £100 a year. I tell you what, my friends, you are deluded and made fools of by wicked men who are acting for their own ends.
You will never get 100 pence a year more than what you have now. It is very possible that you may get less. It is very possible that my lord the bishop and your warden may make changes.
No, 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 interrupted Mr Harding, who had been listening with indescribable misery to the tirade of his son-in-law. No, my friends, I want no changes, at least no changes that shall make you worse off than you now are, as long as you and I live together.
God bless you, Mr Harding, said Bunce, and God bless you, Mr Harding.
God bless you, sir. We know you was always our friend, was exclaimed by enough of the men to make it appear that the sentiment was general. The archdeacon had been interrupted in his speech before he had quite finished it, but he felt that he could not recommence with dignity after this little ebullition, and he led the way back into the garden, followed by his father-in-law.
Well, said he, as soon as he found himself within the cool retreat of the warden's garden, I think I spoke to them plainly, and he wiped the perspiration from his brow. For making a speech under a broiling midday sun in summer, in a full suit of thick black cloth, is warm work.
Yes, you were plain enough, replied the warden, in a tone which did not express approbation.
And that's everything, said the other, who was clearly well satisfied with himself. That's everything with those sort of people. One must be plain, or one will not be understood. Now, I think they did understand me. I think they knew what I meant.
The warden agreed. He certainly thought they had understood to the full what had been said to them.
They know pretty well what they have to expect from us. They know how we shall meet any refractory spirit on their part. They know that we are not afraid of them. And now I'll just step into Chadwick's and tell him what I've done, and then I'll go up to the palace and answer this petition of theirs.
The warden's mind was very full nearly to overcharging itself, and had it done so, had he allowed himself to speak the thoughts which were working within him, he would indeed have astonished the archdeacon by the reprobation he would have expressed as to the proceeding of which he had been so unwilling a witness. But different feelings kept him silent. He was as yet afraid of differing from his son-in-law. He was anxious beyond measure to avoid even a semblance of rupture with any of his order, and was painfully fearful of having to come to an open quarrel with any person on any subject. His life had hitherto been so quiet, so free from strife. His little early troubles had required nothing but passive fortitude. His subsequent prosperity had never forced upon him any active cares, had never brought him into disagreeable contact with any one. He felt that he would give almost anything, much more than he knew he ought to do, to relieve himself from the storm which he feared was coming. It was so hard that the pleasant waters of his little stream should be disturbed and muddied by rough hands, that his quiet paths should be made a battlefield, that the unobtrusive corner of the world which had been allotted to him as though by Providence should be invaded and desecrated, and all within it made miserable and unsound. Money he had none to give. The knack of putting guineas together had never belonged to him. But how willingly,
with what a foolish easiness, with what happy alacrity would he have abandoned the half of his income for all time to come, could he by so doing have quietly dispelled the clouds that were gathering over him, could he have thus compromised the matter between the reformer and the conservative, between his possible son-in-law Bold and his positive son-in-law the archdeacon. And this compromise would not have been made from any prudential motive of saving what would yet remain, for Mr Harding still felt little doubt but he should be left for life in quiet possession of the good things he had, if he chose to retain them. No, he would have done so from the sheer love of quiet, and from a horror of being made the subject of public talk. He had very often been moved to pity, to that inward weeping of the heart for others' woes, but none had he ever pitied more than that old lord, whose almost fabulous wealth, drawn from his church preferments, had become the subject of so much opprobrium, of such public scorn. That wretched clerical octogenarian Croesus, whom men would not allow to die in peace, whom all the world united to decry and to abhor, was he to suffer such a fate? Was his humble name to be bandied in men's mouths as the gormandizer of the resources of the poor, as of one who had filched from the charity of other ages wealth which had been intended to relieve the old and the infirm? Was he to be gibbeted in the press, to become a byword for oppression, to be named as an example of the greed of the English church? Should it ever be said that he had robbed those old men whom he so truly and so tenderly loved in his heart of hearts? As he slowly paced hour after hour under those noble lime trees, turning these sad thoughts within him, he became all but fixed in his resolve that some great step must be taken to relieve him from the risk of so terrible a fate. In the meanwhile, the archdeacon, with contented mind and unruffled spirit, went about his business. He said a word or two to Mr Chadwick, and then, finding, as he expected, the petition lying in his father's library, he wrote a short answer to the men, in which he told them that they had no evils to redress, but rather great mercies for which to be thankful; and having seen the bishop sign it, he got into his brougham and returned home to Mrs Grantly and Plumstead Episcopi. Chapter 6. The Warden's Tea Party. After much painful doubting, on one thing only could Mr Harding resolve. He determined that at any rate he would take no offence, and that he would make this question no cause of quarrel either with Bold or with the bedesmen. In furtherance of this resolution, he himself wrote a note to Mr Bold the same afternoon, inviting him to meet a few friends and hear some music on an evening named in the next week. Had not this little party been promised to Eleanor, in his present state of mind he would probably have avoided such gaiety; but the promise had been given, the invitations were to be written, and when Eleanor consulted her father on the subject, she was not ill pleased to hear him say, "Oh, I was thinking of Bold, so I took it into my head to write to him myself. But you must write to his sister." Mary Bold was older than her brother, and at the time of our story was just over 30. She was not an unattractive young woman, though by no means beautiful. Her great merit was the kindliness of her disposition. She was not very clever, nor very animated, nor had she apparently the energy of her brother, but she was guided by a high principle of right and wrong. Her temper was sweet, and her faults were fewer in number than her virtues. Those who casually met Mary Bold thought little of her, but those who knew her well loved her well, and the longer they knew her, the more they loved her. Among those who were fondest of her was Eleanor Harding, and though Eleanor had never openly talked to her of her brother, each understood the other's feelings about him. The brother and sister were sitting together when the two notes were brought in. "How odd," said Mary, "that they should send two notes. Well, if Mr Harding becomes fashionable, the world is going to change." Her brother understood immediately the nature and intention of the peace offering, but it was not so easy for him to behave well in the matter as it was for Mr Harding. It is much less difficult for the sufferer to be generous than for the oppressor. John Bold felt that he could not go to the warden's party. He never loved Eleanor better than he did now. He had never so strongly felt how anxious he was to make her his wife as now, when so many obstacles to his doing so appeared in view. Yet here was her father himself, as it were, clearing away those very obstacles, and still he felt that he could not go to the house any more as an open friend. As he sat thinking of these things with the note in his hand, his sister was waiting for his decision. "Well," said she, "I suppose we must write separate answers, and both say we shall be very happy."
"You'll go, of course, Mary,"
said he, to which she readily assented.
"I cannot,"
he continued, looking serious and gloomy.
"I wish I could with all my heart."
"And why not, John?" said she. She had as yet heard nothing of the new-found abuse which her brother was about to reform, at least nothing which connected it with her brother's name. He sat thinking for a while, till he determined that it would be best to tell her at once what it was that he was about. It must be done sooner or later. "I fear I cannot go to Mr Harding's house any more as a friend, just at present." "Oh, John, why not? Ah, you've quarrelled with Eleanor."
"No, indeed," said he. "I've no quarrel with her as yet."
"What is it, John?" said she, looking at him with an anxious, loving face, for she knew well how much of his heart was there in that house which he said he could no longer enter.
"Why," said he at last, "I've taken up the case of these 12 old men of Hiram's Hospital, and of course that brings me into contact with Mr Harding. I may have to oppose him, interfere with him, perhaps injure him."
Mary looked at him steadily for some time before she committed herself to reply, and then merely asked him what he meant to do for the old men.
"Why, it's a long story, and I don't know that I can make you understand it. John Hiram made a will, and left his property in charity for certain poor old men, and the proceeds, instead of going to the benefit of these men, go chiefly into the pocket of the warden and the bishop's steward."
"And you mean to take away from Mr Harding his share of it?"
"I don't know what I mean yet. I mean to inquire about it. I mean to see who is entitled to this property. I mean to see, if I can, that justice be done to the poor of the city of Barchester generally, who are in fact the legatees under the will. I mean, in short, to put the matter right, if I can."
"And why are you to do this, John?"
You might ask the same question of anybody else," said he; "and according to that, the duty of righting these poor men would belong to nobody. If we are to act on that principle, the weak are never to be protected, injustice is never to be opposed, and no one is to struggle for the poor." And Bold began to comfort himself in the warmth of his own virtue. "But is there no one to do this but you, who have known Mr Harding so long? Surely, John, as a friend, as a young friend, so much younger than Mr Harding—" "That's woman's logic all over, Mary. What has age to do with it? Another man might plead that he was too old; and as to his friendship, if the thing itself be right, private motives should never be allowed to interfere. Because I esteem Mr Harding, is that a reason that I should neglect a duty which I owe to these old men? Or should I give up a work which my conscience tells me is a good one, because I regret the loss of his society?" "And Eleanor, John?" said the sister, looking timidly into her brother's face. "Eleanor, that is, Miss Harding, if she thinks fit, that is, if her father, or rather if she, or indeed he, if they find it necessary. But there is no necessity now to talk about Eleanor Harding. But this I will say, that if she has the kind of spirit for which I give her credit, she will not condemn me for doing what I think to be a duty." And Bold consoled himself with the consolation of a Roman. Mary sat silent for a while, till at last her brother reminded her that the notes must be answered, and she got up and placed her desk before her, took out her pen and paper, wrote on it slowly, "Pakenham Villas, Tuesday morning. My dear Eleanor, and then stopped and looked at her brother. "Well, Mary, why don't you write it?" "Oh, John," said she, "dear John, pray think better of this." "Think better of what?" said he. "Of this about the hospital, of all this about Mr Harding, of what you say about those old men. Nothing can call upon you, no duty can require you to set yourself against your oldest, your best friend. Oh, John, think of Eleanor. You'll break her heart, and your own." "Nonsense, Mary. Miss Harding's heart is as safe as yours."
Pray, for my sake, John, give it up. You know how dearly you love her." And she came and knelt before him on the rug. "Pray give it up. You are going to make yourself and her father miserable. You are going to make us all miserable, and for what? For a dream of justice. You will never make those 12 men happier than they now are."
"You don't understand it, my dear girl," said he, smoothing her hair with his hand.
"I do understand it, John. I understand that this is a chimera, a dream that you have got. I know well that no duty can require you to do this mad, this suicidal thing. I know you love Eleanor Harding with all your heart, and I tell you now that she loves you as well. If there was a plain, a positive duty before you, I would be the last to bid you neglect it for any woman's love. But this, oh, think again before you do anything to make it necessary that you and Mr Harding should be at variance."
He did not answer as she knelt there, leaning on his knees, but by his face she thought that he was inclined to yield.
"At any rate, let me say that you will go to this party. At any rate, do not break with them while your mind is in doubt."
And she got up, hoping to conclude her note in the way she desired. "My mind is not in doubt," at last he said, rising. I could never respect myself again were I to give way now, because Eleanor Harding is beautiful. I do love her. I would give a hand to hear her tell me what you have said, speaking on her behalf; but I cannot for her sake go back from the task which I have commenced. I hope she may hereafter acknowledge and respect my motives, but I cannot now go as a guest to her father's house." And the Barchester Brutus went out to fortify his own resolution by meditations on his own virtue. Poor Mary Bold sat down and sadly finished her note, saying that she would herself attend the party, but that her brother was unavoidably prevented from doing so. I fear that she did not admire, as she should have done, the self-devotion of his singular virtue. The party went off as such parties do. There were fat old ladies in fine silk dresses, and slim young ladies in gauzy muslin frocks. Old gentlemen stood up with their backs to the empty fireplace, looking by no means so comfortable as they would have done in their own armchairs at home; and young gentlemen, rather stiff about the neck, clustered near the door, not as yet sufficiently encouraged to attack the muslin frocks, who awaited the battle, drawn up in a semicircular array. The warden endeavoured to induce a charge, but failed signally, not having the tact of a general. His daughter did what she could to comfort the forces under her command, who took in refreshing rations of cake and tea, and patiently looked for the coming engagement. But she herself, Eleanor, had no spirit for the work. The only enemy whose lance she cared to encounter was not there, and she and others were somewhat dull. Loud above all voices was heard the clear sonorous tones of the archdeacon, as he dilated to Brother Parsons of the danger of the church, of the fearful rumours of mad reforms even at Oxford, and of the damnable heresies of Dr. Whiston. Soon, however, sweeter sounds began timidly to make themselves audible. Little movements were made in a quarter notable for round stools and music stands. Wax candles were arranged in sconces. Big books were brought from hidden recesses, and the work of the evening commenced. How often were those pegs twisted and retwisted before our friend found that he had twisted them enough! How many discordant scrapes gave promise of the coming harmony! How much the muslin fluttered and crumpled before Eleanor and another nymph were duly seated at the piano! How closely did that tall Apollo pack himself against the wall, with his flute, long as himself, extending high over the heads of his pretty neighbours! Into how small a corner crept that round and florid little minor canon, and there, with skill amazing, found room to tune his accustomed fiddle. And now the crash begins. Away they go in full flow of harmony together, up hill and down dale, now louder and louder, then lower and lower, now loud as though stirring the battle, then low as though mourning the slain. In all, through all, and above all, is heard the violoncello. Ah, not for nothing were those pegs so twisted and retwisted. Listen, listen! Now alone that saddest of instruments tells its touching tale. Silent and in awe stand fiddle, flute, and piano to hear the sorrows of their wailing brother. 'Tis but for a moment. Before the melancholy of those low notes has been fully realized, again comes the full force of all the band. Down go the pedals, away rush 20 fingers, scouring over the bass notes with all the impetus of passion. Apollo blows till his stiff neckcloth is no better than a rope, and the minor canon works with both arms till he falls in a syncope of exhaustion against the wall. How comes it that now, when all should be silent, when courtesy, if not taste, should make men listen, how is it that at this moment the black-coated corps leave their retreat and begin skirmishing? One by one they creep forth and fire off little guns, timidly and without precision. Ah, my men, efforts such as these will take no cities, even though the enemy should be never so open to assault. At length a more deadly artillery is brought to bear. Slowly, but with effect, the advance is made. The muslin ranks are broken and fall into confusion. The formidable array of chairs gives way. The battle is no longer between opposing regiments, but hand to hand and foot to foot with single combatants, as in the glorious days of old, when fighting was really noble. In corners and under the shadow of curtains, behind sofas and half hidden by doors, in retiring windows and sheltered by hanging tapestry, are blows given and returned, fatal, incurable, dealing death. Apart from this, another combat arises, more sober and more serious. The archdeacon is engaged against two prebendaries, a pursy full-blown rector assisting him in all the perils and all the enjoyments of short whist. With solemn energy do they watch the shuffled pack, and all expectant eye the coming trump. With what anxious nicety do they arrange their cards, jealous of each other's eyes. Why is that lean doctor so slow? Cadaverous man with hollow jaw and sunken eye, ill beseeming the richness of his mother church. Ah, why so slow, thou meagre doctor? See how the archdeacon, speechless in his agony, deposits on the board his cards, and looks to heaven or to the ceiling for support. Hark how he sighs, as with thumbs in his waistcoat pocket he seems to signify that the end of such torment is not yet even nigh at hand. Vain is the hope, if hope there be, to disturb that meagre doctor. With care precise he places every card, weighs well the value of each mighty ace, each guarded king, and comfort-giving queen, speculates on knave and ten, counts all his suits, and sets his price upon the whole. At length a card is led, and quick 3 others fall upon the board. The little doctor leads again, while with lustrous eye his partner absorbs the trick. Now thrice has this been done. Thrice has constant fortune favoured the brace of prebendaries ere the archdeacon rouses himself to the battle. But at the 4th assault he pins to the earth a prostrate king, laying low his crown and sceptre, bushy beard, and lowering brow, with a poor deuce. "As David did Goliath," says the archdeacon, pushing over the 4 cards to his partner. And then a trump is led, then another trump, then a king, and then an ace, and then a long 10, which brings down from the meagre doctor his only remaining tower of strength, his cherished queen of trumps. "What, no second club?" says the archdeacon to his partner.
"Only 1 club,"
mutters from his inmost stomach the pursy rector, who sits there red-faced, silent, impervious, careful, a safe but not a brilliant ally. But the archdeacon cares not for many clubs, or for none. He dashes out his remaining cards with a speed most annoying to his antagonists, pushes over to them some 4 cards as their allotted portion, shoves the remainder across the table to the red-faced rector, calls out, 2 by cards, and 2 by honours, and the odd trick last time," marks a treble under the candlestick, and has dealt round the second pack before the meagre doctor has calculated his losses. And so went off the warden's party, and men and women arranging shawls and shoes declared how pleasant it had been, and Mrs. Goodenough, the red-faced rector's wife, pressing the warden's hand, declared she had never enjoyed herself better, which showed how little pleasure she allowed herself in this world, as she had sat the whole evening through in the same chair without occupation, not speaking and unspoken to. And Matilda Johnson, when she allowed young Dickson of the bank to fasten her cloak round her neck, thought that £200 a year and a little cottage would really do for happiness. Besides, he was sure to be manager some day. And Apollo, folding his flute into his pocket, felt that he had acquitted himself with honour, and the archdeacon pleasantly jingled his gains. But the meagre doctor went off without much audible speech, muttering ever and anon as he went, 33 points, 33 points. And so they all were gone, and Mr Harding was left alone with his daughter. What had passed between Eleanor Harding and Mary Bold need not be told. It is indeed a matter of thankfulness that neither the historian nor the novelist hears all that is said by their heroes or heroines, or how would 3 volumes or 20 suffice? In the present case, so little of this sort have I overheard, that I live in hopes of finishing my work within 300 pages, and of completing that pleasant task, a novel in 1 volume. But something had passed between them, and as the warden blew out the wax candles and put his instrument into its case, his daughter stood sad and thoughtful by the empty fireplace, determined to speak to her father, but irresolute as to what she would say. "Well, Eleanor," said he, "are you for bed?" "Yes," said she, moving, "I suppose so. But, papa, Mr Bold was not here tonight. Do you know why not?" "He was asked. I wrote to him myself," said the warden. "But do you know why he did not come, papa?" "Well, Eleanor, I could guess, but it's no use guessing at such things, my dear. What makes you look so earnest about it?" "Oh, papa, do tell me," she exclaimed, throwing her arms round him and looking into his face. "What is it he is going to do? What is it all about? Is there any she didn't well know what word to use, any danger?" "Danger, my dear? What sort of danger?" "Danger to you, danger of trouble and of loss and of Oh, papa, why haven't you told me of all this before?" Mr Harding was not the man to judge harshly of anyone, much less of the daughter whom he now loved better than any living creature. But still he did judge her wrongly at this moment. He knew that she loved John Bold. He fully sympathized in her affection. Day after day he thought more of the matter, and, with the tender care of a loving father, tried to arrange in his own mind how matters might be so managed that his daughter's heart should not be made the sacrifice to the dispute which was likely to exist between him and Bold. Now, when she spoke to him for the first time on the subject, it was natural that he should think more of her than of himself, and that he should imagine that her own cares, and not his, were troubling her. He stood silent before her a while, as she gazed up into his face, and then, kissing her forehead, he placed her on the sofa. "Tell me, Nelly," he said, He only called her Nelly in his kindest, softest, sweetest moods, and yet all his moods were kind and sweet. "Tell me, Nelly, do you like Mr Bold much?" She was quite taken aback by the question. I will not say that she had forgotten herself and her own love in thinking about John Bold, and while conversing with Mary. She certainly had not done so. She had been sick at heart to think that a man of whom she could not but own to herself
that she loved him,
of whose regard she had been so proud, that such a man should turn against her father to ruin him. She had felt her vanity hurt that his affection for her had not kept him from such a course. Had he really cared for her, he would not have risked her love by such an outrage. But her main fear had been for her father, and when she spoke of danger, it was of danger to him and not to herself. She was taken aback by the question altogether. "Do I like him, papa?" "Yes, Nelly. Do you like him? Why shouldn't you like him? But that's a poor word. Do you love him?" She sat still in his arms without answering him. She certainly had not prepared herself for an avowal of affection, intending, as she had done, to abuse John Bold herself, and to hear her father do so also. "Come, my love," said he, "let us make a clean breast of it. Do you tell me what concerns yourself, and I will tell you what concerns me and the hospital." And then, without waiting for an answer, he described to her, as he best could, the accusation that was made about Hiram's will, the claims which the old men put forward, what he considered the strength and what the weakness of his own position, the course which Bold had taken, and that which he presumed he was about to take. And then, by degrees, without further question, he presumed on the fact of Eleanor's love, and spoke of that love as a feeling which he could in no way disapprove. He apologized for Bold, excused what he was doing, nay, praised him for his energy and intentions, made much of his good qualities, and harped on none of his foibles. Then, reminding his daughter how late it was, and comforting her with much assurance which he hardly felt himself, he sent her to her room with flowing eyes and a full heart. When Mr Harding met his daughter at breakfast the next morning, there was no further discussion on the matter, nor was the subject mentioned between them for some days. Soon after the party, Mary Bold called at the hospital, but there were various persons in the drawing room at the time, and she therefore said nothing about her brother. On the day following, John Bold met Miss Harding in one of the quiet, sombre, shaded walks of the close. He was most anxious to see her, but unwilling to call at the warden's house, and had in truth waylaid her in her private haunts. "My sister tells me," said he, abruptly hurrying on with his premeditated speech, "my sister tells me that you had a delightful party the other evening. I was so sorry I could not be there." "We were all sorry," said Eleanor with dignified composure. "I believe, Miss Harding, you understand why at this moment—" and Bold hesitated, muttered, stopped, commenced his explanation again, and again
broke down.
Eleanor would not help him in the least. "I think my sister explained to you, Miss Harding." "Pray don't apologize, Mr Bold. My father will, I am sure, always be glad to see you, if you like to come to the house now as formerly. Nothing has occurred to alter his feelings. Of your own views you are, of course, the best judge." "Your father is all that is kind and generous. He always was so. But you, Miss Harding, yourself, I hope you will not judge me harshly because—" "Mr Bold," said she, "you may be sure of one thing: I shall always judge my father to be right, and those who oppose him I shall judge to be wrong. If those who do not know him oppose him, I shall have charity enough to believe that they are wrong through error of judgment; but should I see him attacked by those who ought to know him and to love him and revere him, of such I shall be constrained to form a different opinion." And then, curtseying low, she sailed on, leaving her lover in anything but a happy state of mind. Chapter VII.